That is Switchfoot on Rima and More Than Fine.
The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
Andrew Urquhart with you on the first in what is going to be a series of panel discussions about election issues. Today we're talking about the economy. Is this something which is likely to influence your vote? We are live on Rima, also streaming on Rima, Life FM, Star and Shine TV social media. Hey, as always, would appreciate your comments on anything that we say today. My guests on the program is Paul Barber. He is the Senior Policy Analyst for the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit of the Salvation Army. Paul, kia ora, thank you for your time today.
Morning.
Also joining us is Dr. Eric Crampton, Chief Economist of the New Zealand Initiative. Kia ora, Eric.
Good morning.
And also joining me in the studio is Auckland City Missioner Helen Robinson. Helen, kia ora. Firstly, Paul, if we can go to you, talking about the cost of living, this is probably the key issue this election. Many people, of course, are doing it tough around the motu, although some people are doing it tougher than others, perhaps. Earlier this year, you and the team at the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit released a report, the State of the Nation report, entitled Costs of Living, looking at, well, how much there is an equal opportunity for people to participate in society financially and in other ways. When you're talking costs of living, broader than just the dollars, Paul.
Yeah, kia ora, yeah. That was the key thing for us in this year's State of the Nation report, is recognising that that it is a time where those who are on the lowest incomes, those on the margins, are feeling the pain the most from the rising cost pressures. But yes, we wanted to draw the fact that when we're talking about the costs of living, when we don't just mean those what you're paying out in the supermarket and that, but also the wider social impacts that reach across our communities through the stresses that come with economic pressures. And also that is part of the pathway towards a better society. So we're talking really about the stresses of people trying to get by with low incomes, trying to meet daily costs, facing increasing indebtedness, especially for those who are on the fixed incomes and have limited options to access finance. We're looking at the cost of housing, but seeing that from the perspective, when we look at the cost of living, we begin with the communities and the people that we're working with in the Salvation Army. We work with around 150,000 people every year, and they're people who are facing a lot of pressures in life, and we're looking for economic and social solutions that work for them, because we know what works for those most in need will work for all of us. And they're also the people suffering the greatest harm from rising costs of housing, rising costs of basic food, of energy, and so forth. So we look for solutions that are focused on how to lift people out of income poverty, how to bring people's access to a better quality and more affordable housing that they're most likely going to have to rent or access through social housing. And look at those stresses that are falling on particularly younger people. One of the real headline things that came out of our work this year is just how the young people are feeling that mental distress from the social and economic pressures on them. And with 1 in 4 people in 19 to 24 age group reporting high to moderate to high levels of mental distress, that's a real sign of our need to get beside people in many ways.
Now, one of the challenges, I suppose, from an economics point of view is it is difficult to help those struggling. It's difficult for a government to help those struggling without increasing inflation. I mean, throwing money at the problem literally becomes the problem, and that cycle continuates. Eric, bringing you in on that topic, attempting to get inflation under control, I mean, that just pushes up interest rates, and now everybody's worse off, right?
Well, it's a shame that we've gotten into this spot, right? So the Reserve Bank's one big job that nobody else can do is keeping inflation between 1% and 3%.
Yep.
And its response to COVID was a little over the top. It made sense in March 2020 when everybody was expecting massive amounts of unemployment. And while it moved to reverse course faster than some central banks, it moved larger than other central banks and needed to have pulled back a little bit more quickly, because it is obvious a little earlier here that we weren't heading for economic disaster in that way. So instead, inflation is blown out. That has a few effects. It's obviously hitting cost of living, because that's kind of the nature of inflation, right? It's just a generalized rise in prices. But while benefits can increase with inflation and wages increase with inflation, one thing that hasn't been increasing with inflation is the income tax thresholds. So currently, even job seeker benefit is about $17,000. Well, 14,000 is the bottom tax bracket. Wow. So you've got people on job seeker benefit who are pushed into the 17.5% rate who should have been in the 10.5% rate, because those have not been adjusted since 2010. Accumulated fiscal drag since then, the bottom tax threshold should be about $19,000 if it had been keeping up with inflation from 2010. The 48,000 one would be up to about 65. The 70,000 one would be up to about 95. So governments like to get a lot more money in as revenues without having to go to Parliament to ask for supply, just by letting inflation do the job for them. But it's tragic, right? It takes money directly out of people's pockets. And the really annoying bit is, like, you see Labor talking about things like taking GST off of fruit and vegetables to leave people with more money to spend on fruit and vegetables. Well, the assessment on it was like $210 a year for the average household. Well, just moving the $14,000 tax band up to $17,000 would give you the same amount of money. Okay.
Hey, look,
and that would,
we'll get more specifically into taxes in just a moment. I mean, all good points.
But it factors into cost of living, right?
It does.
That's why I bring it up there. At the same time, housing is insane. It's less of a let's give more accommodation support and more of a let's fix housing supply, because the worry that economists have on this is if you don't get supply right, you just wind up making rents higher.
Yeah. Now, just wanting to, I suppose, broaden this out a little bit, because with the boosting interest rates, in some ways that's just spread the poverty burden, hasn't it? I mean, we've got homeowners now who can't afford their mortgages. We've got increased interest rates, which are affecting whether or not businesses have the capital to invest. Technically, we're in a recession, but honestly, is that working? Is a technical recession what it needs to turn the economy around, to take the gas pedal off the cost of living crisis that we have? Open to comments from anyone on this one.
I'll just jump in at this. The whole point of policy is to reduce aggregate demand, right? So the economy has been overheated. We have too much money chasing after too few goods. Pulling back on some of that demand, both by having the central government pull back on spending, would be nice, but that's the whole job of the Reserve Bank, right? Getting everybody to spend less because there are fewer goods in the out and about than there is money chasing after it. So that's policy doing what it has to, given the prior failures.
Paul, you wanted to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think we've got to be really careful that some of the cures that are being talked about are worse than the disease, and one of the facts that we have to recognize is that if we are talking about some of the inflationary pressures, it's been about a deliberate attempt to engineer a recession, because a recession is deemed somehow to be good for the economy. Well, when we look at the economy from the point of view of those that are working with the Salvation Army, we say, well, a recession means more unemployment. That means more people in hardship. That means actually worse consequences for people on the margins. And so our real appeal in this process is to recognize the fact that if you're going to address some of those what are called aggregate demand pressures, that is putting governments spending or giving people more money, perhaps you need to think about who you give what to and how you spend those resources. And at this point in time, we would be arguing we're still not doing enough to lift people out of poverty. We're not doing enough
Yeah, Helen,
to
what do
reduce hardship.
Thank you, Helen, wanting to bring you in here. So thank you for your
Certainly,
patience. Yeah.
It's all right. Just a really genuine good question that I'm often asking is who is not at the table, or actually who is suffering or bearing the burden of the decisions that our greater society, including our government, are making.
Mhm.
And it's pretty clear that that burden is not spread evenly or fairly or justly. Paul has mentioned a number of groups already this morning. We certainly know the reality that women bear the burden of poverty in our society, and particularly Māori and Pacific women, and particularly women raising children alone. So whatever answer we as a country come to is actually a plea really on behalf of the mission and many people in our country is to actually say, how can we create a society where everybody participates, where the suffering is actually not a kind of suffering that leads to people literally being starving or literally being excluded from, in real terms, from education, or who are literally in emergency housing for a long time.
I mean, it's okay to talk about tax breaks for the squeezed middle, as it were, but is that ethically justifiable when people at the lower levels are being crushed with child poverty and homelessness issues there? Just a question on this one more broadly, and Eric, will get back to you to finish this section before we go to the break. In terms of lower level, income and benefits, is it keeping pace with inflation? Okay, there's a lot of pain around. Is it being shared equitably, in your opinion, Helen?
Absolutely not. And I think I'd ask a deeper question that says, particularly in terms of benefit levels, are they enough?
Okay.
There is multiple repeated evidence happening across our country, across years, that is saying that our benefit levels are not enough for people to live on. So by definition of receiving a benefit, you are going to be hungry, you are going to be excluded, you are not going to be able to participate fully within our society.
Eric, did you want to jump in on that before we go to the break?
Well, just getting a few of the stats in here. So first off, we have talked a little bit about recession, but remember that employment rates right now and for the past year have been at or near highs that haven't been seen for 40 years.
Yeah.
If you go through the data, you do not see employment rates as high as they are now for 4 decades. Okay?
I mean, that's a great thing, but is the cost inflation?
Well, what it means is we have unsustainably high employment rates.
Mm-hmm.
So we're revving the engine above its capacity, and it'll blow out if we let it keep running this high. All right. So it's not trying to engineer a recession. If the government gets this right, if the Reserve Bank gets it right, they're trying to get a soft landing where you get down to sort of the natural rate of unemployment rather than engineering a recession. If we also look at the child poverty statistics, agree that it's terrible, but it's down on 2019. So if you look at material hardship, it's down. The number of children in material hardship is lower than it was in 2019. We shouldn't lose sight of the underlying stats here. We can say that like it's bad relative to some ideal point, but it's not some worsening thing. It's no worse than it was in 2019, and the numbers show that it's better.
Well, hey, I'm sure there's going to be some debate on this particular topic. We're going to go to a break. We'll be back with my guests in just a moment, talking about the economics behind the election, encouraging you to thoughtfully and prayerfully consider issues that are important to you as you cast your vote to this coming election. Back with more from the panel in just a moment.
The panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
Imagine facing the terror of someone's anger for no apparent reason. Average of 1 in 4 New Zealand children continue to suffer abuse and neglect. That's 2 children every hour. Without support, they could become hurting adults, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Let's help to stop this by donating to Homes of Hope. Help the children heal, start to flourish and become great New Zealanders. Visit homesofhope.org.nz. Homes of Hope, building our children together.
Awake New Zealand. A morning without Mossop's honey is just a...
Their team understand how important it is to find a locksmith you can trust. For anything with locks, keys and security, Lockman is available anytime, any day, Auckland-wide. Lockman security technicians are just a call away. Call Auckland's mobile locksmith, Lockman, 0800 562 593.
I lost my hair at the end of November. It felt like everything was going wrong.
Every week.
On Rima.
Andrew Urquhart with you on the program today, talking the economy and in particular whether or not this is an area which will influence the way in which you vote. Interested in your thoughts on this. As always, you can text and contact us through social media. We're live on Rima, also streaming live on Rima, Star, Life FM and Shine TV social media platforms through our Facebook channel. So any comments on there are welcome as always. My guests on the program, Auckland City Missioner Helen Robinson. In the studio with me, we have Paul Barber from the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit of the Salvation Army. He joins us by Zoom. And also Dr. Eric Crampton, Chief Economist of the New Zealand Initiative. Thank you, guys, again for your time. Eric, starting with you this time and wanting to talk taxes, because honestly, all other government policy rests on this issue. Whatever is promised in these campaigns, they're going to have to pay for it somehow, and that involves taking money off good people like you and me. Increasing taxes, honestly, this is a political suicide, even if it's an economic necessity. Would you agree?
I'm not sure it's an economic necessity. It's an economic necessity relative to current levels of government spending because, well, they're spending more than they're taking in tax.
Yep.
But you have to wonder about current levels of spending. If you go back to even in 2019, if you remember, that was the well-being budget campaign. Everybody thought that this budget that was filled with flowers and lovely things was going to save the world, solve every problem there was. That budget was projecting that the government in 2023 was going to be spending 28.8% of GDP. Okay. Actual spend from the budget update in 2023 was 32.5. Okay. So government has increased spending by about $14.5 billion relative to what they said they were going to do in the well-being budget. Now, this isn't an inflation thing. This is as fraction of GDP. Okay, so GDP gets bigger, Government's taking a bigger fraction of it, a much bigger fraction of it, and or spending a much bigger fraction of it. Now you have to wonder what we get for that. So there's about $1.5 billion of that of support for the cyclone. You'd want to be taking on debt to deal with that and rearranging other spend. But where the rest of it, you can't really point to that many improved outcomes. Yes, we've had reductions in child poverty. That'd be stuff that was in the 2019 budget. The rest of it seems a lot of consultancy reports on projects that'll never go anywhere and failed mergers of different administrative units. So,
I mean, there was, of course, the working tax group on, reports about how we could change our tax system. You were talking beforehand about ways in which we could change that. Was there a missed opportunity that all this money was spent on a report whose recommendations were ignored? What's your thoughts?
Well, the useful things that come out of these reports is the warnings of what things not to do, right? So every time they go through the standard drill of what are populist things that people might jump at during an election campaign so we can make sure that everybody knows that it's a bad idea. And one of them was the useful report on GST, reminding everybody how GST works and the perils of trying to muck around in it by exempting things. I don't know if they had particular foresight of what Hipkins would wind up promising this go round, but they rehearsed all of those arguments, and that was useful. In this one, there was a slight majority in favor of putting in a capital gains tax. In the prior tax working group, there's a slight majority against putting in a capital gains tax. It's I don't really see it as a huge deal either way, because we've had a tax system that's evolved for 4 decades in the absence of one that keeps redefining income to make sure that...
In some ways, it seems like it was as much of a focus group as it was a working group. That, hey, let's run this up the flagpole, see what poll results we get as a reaction.
Oh, for GST on food, for sure. Yeah, that was entirely focus group driven. They figured that it would get them a boost in the polls. But as much as you might like the extra $210 or thereabouts from taking GST off of one thing, remember that GST systems that are full of holes collect a lot less revenue. It leaves government with fewer opportunities to do things that you might want them to be able to do. It's not particularly equitable because people like me who are on higher incomes and spend a lot more money on everything, well, we spend more money on the things that would be GST exempt as well. So we get a disproportionate benefit from it. And one hole begets another. Whenever you look at international tax systems, they're all riddled with these things. And what it means is that to raise an amount of revenue equivalent to the size of the economy as New Zealand's GST, Hungary has to have a GST that's about 28%.
Wow.
Okay. They raise about as much money through their GST as we raise through ours, but at a much higher rate because they've got all these silly exemptions through it. It's great for the lawyers and accountants who, well, have to waste their lives arguing the cost.
And hey, lawyers and economists and accountants are part of the economy too, so no judgment there. Helen, wanting to bring you in on this one. I mean, cheaper food, particularly cheaper healthy foods. I mean, you're involved with your team running one of the largest food banks in the country. Cheaper fruit and veggies, is that a good place to start, or is it a little bit of a sparkly treat to distract us in the election?
There's a whole series of comments and questions, and I genuinely want to answer your question by going no, yes, or yes, no. So anything that supports people to access good quality food that makes it more accessible, I would want to support. The reality is that the people that we are dealing with, so we have 50,000 families or 50,000 food parcels we distributed in the last financial year. Every one of those feeds a family of 4 for 3 meals for 4 days. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of people here in Auckland who don't have enough money for food. That the families who are coming to us, who are predominantly, again, single women raising children alone, have $20 or $30 a week to provide food for a family of 3 or 4. So the removal of GST on food on one level is great, but actually this is not going to feed a family that is genuinely hungry.
Slightly problematic at all, removing it from perishable goods with variable pricing on it. It's going to be ridiculous to even manage, really, isn't it?
And incredibly complex. Now, what I do want to affirm is that it's raising in our national consciousness and understanding that hundreds of thousands of us, and we believe about 20% of New Zealand, does not have access to enough money for food.
Yeah.
So what actually are we going to do as a country to ensure that all of us are fed well, sustainably, and deep into our future?
Look, I wanted to ask you another question in particular about, I suppose, the mood of the nation as you see it, because as we mentioned at the beginning, for a lot of people we are doing it tough, although perhaps some more than others. You are, of course, a charitable organisation based on philanthropy as well as a bit of government funding, but do you feel that there's a public mood to be more generous to those who are perhaps on lower levels of poverty, even given the impact of the cost of living crisis on the squeezed middle, as it were? Or honestly, is it more, hey, we've got to look after our own interests now? What's your experience?
New Zealand is a funny culture. I often experience it as many things happening at once. So one of the privileges I have of being part of the mission is I literally get to see the generosity and compassion, particularly of Auckland, but New Zealand more broadly, on a daily, if not hourly basis, very, very genuinely. And in my 10 years at the mission, I have not seen a drop in that sense of generosity.
Wow.
And I'm incredibly proud of us for that. In the same instance, on a daily basis, I experience a vitriol and judgment against people who are suffering deeply. We condemn people to poverty, and then, importantly, we condemn them for being poor.
Yeah.
So there is something in our psyche that says you are a bad person, you are morally bad because you are daring to raise 3 children alone. Therefore, the reality of the work of raising children means you can't be in paid employment. And for that fact, we're going to pay you so little that you and your children are going to starve.
Yeah.
What does that actually say about us as a society? So the generosity and the compassion is part of who we are, but vitriol and judgment is also sadly part of who we are.
Paul, wanting to bring you in this one because, again, a charitable organisation dependent on philanthropy to an extent. The vitriol goes the other way as well, and I know for a lot of people there's this big campaign, look, tax the rich, they've got so much money. Is this just envy politics in your point of view, or is there a case for more tax for the wealthiest New Zealanders? What's your view?
Well, I think you've got to close that kind of circle that Eric was talking about, that links to and link that to what Helen's talking about and where we're coming from in this. The revenue that we gather through tax is about doing things together as a country that we can't do on our own. So Eric seems to manage to miss out the fact that most of what government spends is on, the biggest single amount government spends is on New Zealand superannuation to support people in their older age. The next couple biggest things are in our health system and our education system. Actually, our welfare system is comparatively small in comparison to those areas. Those things are crucial to our health system has been absolutely crucial throughout the COVID time. And we've learned out of that looking after people, looking after those who are in need, is what the foundation for what makes our economy and our country work. Therefore, if we need to gather that revenue, it's really important to have a good discussion about how we gather that revenue. And talking about income tax and GST misses the whole area that was addressed by the most recent work on tax in New Zealand, that looked at the capacity of those, the wealthiest amongst us, to have a fair share of the necessary revenue gathering. So yeah, if we want to look after those who are most in need, and we have a whole bunch of people who really still need more support, Eric's right, we've reduced child poverty in New Zealand precisely because we've used government revenue to lift the incomes of those who are most in need, and that's the 210,000 children in welfare households, for instance. We have been fortunate to have high employment, low unemployment, and to suggest that the fact that we've still got 100,000 people registered unemployment, a couple of 100,000 who would like a job but can't get one, to say that's too many people employed, we've got not enough unemployed, I find that a really bit of a sad indictment of how we approach our economics.
Yeah.
So we really need to think pretty hard about who pays the cost and who can make a better contribution to our collective well-being. And I think it's a very good question to ask of those wealthiest amongst us. Indeed, some have already said they would like to see some form of wealth tax, and particularly could be about rebalancing our tax system away from its dependence on GST, its dependence on income tax on the middle, and ask those who have the most to step up and share more.
Now, just as we wrap up this section, Eric, if I'm just wanting to do a quick fire round, if that's okay, and then we're going to go to a break and have our final session together. But just I've got a range of different tax policies that different parties are saying, hey, here's our idea of what we could do to change the tax system. Now, from each of you, for each of these tax ideas, I'm wanting a yes or no, a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or as briefly as possible so we can get through the list. Does that sound all right? Eric, starting with you, taking GST off fruit and veggies, yes or no?
Horrible idea.
Helen?
Let's do something else with it.
Okay, and Paul?
It's not the best way to do it.
Okay, I think that's that's an epic round of fail. Taxing the super rich. Now, whether this is capital gains tax or a wealth tax, yes or no? Helen, we'll start with you this time.
Absolutely, we'll support a better wealth distribution.
Eric?
No, the tax balance is already towards the higher income. We could have a productive conversation sometime about a land tax, but generalized wealth taxes, no.
And Paul?
We definitely feel a wealth tax is something we need to really discuss as a country and really think hard about how to do it.
Okay, next one. Foreign investors and multinational companies, should we increase the tax on them? Eric, starting with you this time.
Only through a multilateral process, not going out on our own. Only through the OECD.
Okay, and Paul, any comments on
that? What kind of tax are you talking about here?
Taxing foreign investors and multinational companies who trade in New Zealand. This is, essentially National's tax policy pushed a lot in this direction.
And Labour's.
Well,
yeah.
I think that there's definitely a need for a fairness in that approach. Yeah, so I guess there is a need to work something out. But I think what we may be talking about two different things. I think here, because there's the whole international tax process of having a consistent rate internationally, or the specific tax that's being proposed by the National Party on foreign property buyers. I'm not.
Yeah.
They're two different things.
Sorry, there's too broad a principle. Helen, up to a certain level of income, pay no tax. Would you be in favour of that?
Anything, again, that appropriately supports better wealth distribution, I'll support.
Paul, your thoughts?
A tax-free threshold is great, but you've got to realise it goes to everyone. So you need to think about how you structure your tax system to pay for it. So yes, that will help those on the margin if you can fund it.
And Eric, finally, on that one.
I'm ambivalent about it. You can structure a benefit system around the existence of tax at a $14,000 rate or around its absence. It's all in dot. It all ties together, right? It's a simultaneously decided thing.
Well, guys, a surprising amount of agreement on the topic of taxes from the three of you. We will be back with more, continuing to talk about the economy and the sorts of things you may want to consider when deciding where to cast your votes, in particular if the economy or the current cost of living crisis is something which is affecting you. Probably one of the key issues this election year. Back with more from the panel in just a moment.
The panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
Multimag, a testimonial from Mary. I found Multimag effervescent powder easy to take with a
economics, and some very special guests on the program. We've got Paul Barber from the Salvation Army Social Policy Unit, Dr. Rick Crampton from, he's the Chief Economist at the New Zealand Initiative, and Auckland City Missioner Helen Robinson. Hey, thanks very much for everybody who's joining us on the live stream as well. You can, of course, put your comments or questions there, live streaming on Rima, Star, Life FM and Shine TV, and, of course, broadcasting live on Rima as well. Now, getting towards the end of the conversation, one of the things that, it seems that there is cross-party support for, one of the few economic policies that all of the parties think, yes, is a good idea, and that's improved financial literacy, teaching young people in particular how to be better with their money. Helen, wanting to get your comments on this first of all, is this realistic, or is it patronising to say, hey, we can help the poor by teaching them how to be better with their lack of money? What's your thoughts?
So there's a both and answer here, I think, how we as a society can together more broadly grow in our financial literacy as individuals and as a collective, from my point of view, can only be a good thing. So I think that's the first kind of context statement. Secondly, to very specifically answer your question, the thousands of people that we are seeing on a weekly basis do not need financial literacy. What they need is more income. This is very, very clearly a game of income and against expenditure. And if your expenditure is more than your income, this is not about budgeting or literacy. Then the only kind of codicil or separate point that I would put to that is that we have created systems all over that are highly legalistic.
Yeah.
And when you are in a space or an environment where you literally over time do not have enough money, it is always a good thing to get help. So overwhelmingly, believing that poor people are poor because they don't know how to budget is just literally inaccurate.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Paul, wanting to get your comments on this one, as well as raising taxes, of course, another way the government can get money is to borrow it, and that's something which they have done particularly since COVID. However, some would say that government borrowing is becoming part of the problem, borrowing money to pay for their election promises, particularly, the burden of debt for average New Zealanders. And, I suppose the real cost of living beyond our means. This is something which I'm sure you experience in your work at the Salvation Army.
Well, yes, we're working every day with people who, as Helen says, their means are not sufficient to meet and they seek help and often need to come for support. And financial mentoring services are a big part of the work of the Salvation Army. And I guess the key message out of that work is, as Helen says, you can't budget if your income is simply inadequate.
Yeah.
If we were running our society in such a way that we could demonstrate that people were receiving an income that is livable, that would be enough for a decent standard of living, then we can really have a discussion. However, it is important that we support people to try and avoid getting into debt, to have better financial literacy, and education around that is crucial at all stages in life. I think I'd like to point out, and one of the experiences we have in our work and our advocacy, is that our financial system has become more and more complex as our society has deregulated areas, and the relentless creativity of the finance sector in developing new products means that there are new pitfalls emerging too for those who are in need. And I think this is one area where we really need vigilance about. We've had a really successful attempt to improve our credit laws to make to basically put payday lending out of business. But there are always other areas of high cost, dodgy insurance, like car insurance, or dodgy ways that finance is done. Even and the new products such as buy now, pay later, those are all things that in certain contexts can be useful, but they can be deeply problematic when you don't have enough and this becomes your only option.
That's fine. Even I suppose the Aussie banks, as you were saying before, Eric, the accountants, the lawyers, the economists, the Aussie banks, they're getting rich. But honestly, just as we're coming to a close here, is it possible, in your view, for us to grow our way out of our current economic woes? Things like wealth creation, investment, measures of productivity, those sorts of things. Of course, if our economy grows, that leads to a bigger tax take without having to go deeper into people's pockets. Do you believe that's a realistic strategy in this current climate?
I think there's a good way of doing it yet through housing supply reform. So Labor made some really good moves as part of its urban growth agenda to free up some aspects of land supply so that you could get more density in places where people want to live. They've made an attempt to free up infrastructure funding and financing to get some of the tools to support infrastructure growth. Unfortunately, it's the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act doesn't quite get us there, and Labor forgot to ease growth constraints at city fringes. So while Auckland apartments were able to get a little bit more affordable, overall housing is still insane. So whenever we're talking about cost of living issues, it's after tax, after housing cost, money that you've got left over, right?
Yeah.
And if housing just eats everything else that the government does or everything else that the economy does in improving productivity just gets eaten up in housing costs. There was a neat paper that came out in the National NBER Working Paper Series, David Card, showing that because of city constraints in the US, productivity improvements there just turn into land price appreciation in the cities that are constrained. And we've got the same problem here. We can grow our way out of that if we get rid of the restrictions on building housing in places where people want to live. And that would let productivity growth turn into real after tax, after housing cost, disposable income improvement, rather than just land price appreciation. It's incredibly important. It's foundational for everything else.
Instead of productivity, we've got a housing market in that regard. Hey, look, we are just about out of time, but I just want to do one more quick round. And, okay, apologies in advance that this is going to be really simplified. But from each of you, what I would like is what you believe is the one key economic issue, the most important economic issue that people should consider when deciding who to vote for. Helen, could we start with you?
Housing.
Housing. Eric?
Housing.
And Paul? You don't have to say housing.
We're a wealthy country. We can afford to look after everyone in this country. And the one thing we need to think about is making sure that everyone has a livable income in this country.
Guys, really appreciate your comments, your wisdom, your insight on what has been a complicated matter, and thank you for bearing with me as we've played hopscotch on the economic minefield and tried to cover a wide range of information in a short period of time. I do know that this will be helpful to our listeners in terms of helping them to make an informed and prayerful decision. As we go to the polls, we get to have our say. Hey, we may not be economists or financial experts, but we are, of course, impacted by the economic policies of, the next government of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Eric, you mentioned off air beforehand, if people wanted to go a little bit deeper into some of the stats and information, and Paul, I know that you guys have got some information on this as well, but if you guys wanted to share web resources, where can people go to find out more?
Everything that we have is on our website. I'd also encourage checking the child poverty stats either with Salvation Army or with Stats New Zealand. Just go to the SNZ website and look up child poverty. You can get the material deprivation figures right there.
And of course, Paul, salvationarmy.org.nz. There's a whole bunch of the key issues and policy areas that you and your team have unpacked. Guys, again, thank you once again for being on the program. Thanks for being on the panel today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.